You are listening to In Pursuit of Development with Dan Bannock.
Smuggling is one of those words that instantly conjures up images of crime thrillers and dark border crossings. We tend to think of it as unambiguously bad. It takes resources away from the state, undermines the rule of law, corrodes trust, and is often associated with trafficking, drugs, or even terrorism. In much of our public debate, smugglers stand on one side, the state on the other, locked in a permanent cat-and-mouse game at the border. My guest today invites us to look again and look much more closely. He argues that smuggling is not simply about weakening states, but it can in fact serve core state interests in order and stability. Rather than an activity at the margins, smuggling emerges as an integrated and deeply political part of how societies function in North Africa. Max Gallion is a political scientist and research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, at the University of Sussex. He specializes in the political economy of development, particularly taxation and the politics of informal and illegal economies. His latest book is Smugglers and the State, Negotiating the Maghreb at its Margins. I have to admit, it is one of the most compelling analyses I've read of how smuggling actually works and how states engage with it. Focusing on Tunisia and Morocco, the book shows how practices that appear puzzling from a law and order perspective, such as states openly tolerating and even regulating smuggling, make sense once we see them in their wider political context. The rents generated through regulated smuggling have long been and remain central to North Africa's political settlements. Alongside the familiar formal authoritarian bargain of jobs, subsidies, and stability in exchange for political assent, there has always been a second, informal authoritarian bargain. In this arrangement, political acquiescence is exchanged for the visible toleration of informal and illegal income-generating activities, from street vending and cannabis cultivation to smuggling itself. These activities do not take place behind the state's back. Rather, they operate through tacit understandings in which the state purposefully and visibly turns a blind eye. They are part of an arrangement with the state, not outside it. And all of this is happening at a time of intense anxiety about borders. Since the early 2000s, the number of walls and fences has multiplied, together with a booming security industry promising to make borders tighter and more technologically advanced. Politicians in Europe, North America, and elsewhere frequently speak about taking back control. However, as Max shows in his brilliant book, the reality is far more complex and often less effective than these narratives imply. So in today's episode, Max and I explore what smuggling reveals about how states actually function, how border communities negotiate their place within political systems, and what this means for development policy in an age of walls and wire. If you're enjoying Season 6, I'd be very grateful if you could share the links to the podcast as widely as possible in your networks. This is Dan Bannock, and you are listening to In Pursuit of Development. Max, you've been very patient with me. You've been waiting for a long time to come on the show. My apologies, but I'm really delighted to see you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
We often think about smuggling as a bad thing. It is a bad thing. It takes resources away from the state. It reduces the legitimacy. It can get terrorists in, lots and lots of bad things. But it turns out it's not always bad, is it? It can sometimes even make a state. So tell us a little bit about perhaps some of the other not so known aspects of smuggling that conventional wisdom often ignores.
Yeah, I think the point about conventional wisdom is a really good starting point. So we might think of smuggling as a good thing or a bad thing, but I think most commonly we don't think that much about it at all. I think we assume that we have a vague sense of how it works. We've seen it in movies, And we assume that we have a vague sense of what it means for development and also what we do about it. We kind of very much live in an era where concern and anxiety around borders is really having a moment, both in kind of nationalist politics, but also very concretely in infrastructure on the ground. So the amount of border fences, border fortifications around the world have quadrupled since the early 2000s. There's an enormous industry in helping states build new fences, new walls, new border infrastructure. And a lot of it draws on this generalized anxiety that there's a battle about an orderly globalization between kind of the forces of infrastructure and security and control and these illicit actors that are undermining states and that are kind of teeming in this dark underbelly of globalization. And I think the starting point for both my work, but a lot of other work on smuggling in the last couple of years has been that this assumes that smugglers and states are these antagonists, that these kind of cat and mouse robbers and policemen, actors that chase each other at the border, and that kind of backing up the state with more infrastructure is the obvious response to that. And that to anyone who's done empirical work with smugglers, who's interviewed smugglers, who spent time on borders, or anyone who's from border communities, often knows that that's not quite what happens in practice, that the reality is often more complicated, that smuggling is often a lot less anarchic than we think it is, that it's often a lot more regulated, that there are these informal deals and arrangements that states make with smugglers, the type of activities that are tolerated because there's an understanding that they're embedded in local livelihoods. And all this then starts to become quite a different story than this kind of cat and mouse game that we assume it is. And all of this then starts to explain why a lot of the infrastructure that we're building isn't doing what we think it is. And I think it opens up a more interesting conversation around the relationship between states and illegal activities, but also border communities and state building, but also better development interventions in these areas.
So, when reading your book, I was thinking, the question, why smuggle? And there are many, many reasons for this. You touched upon at least something that is super important in the United States and in Europe, which is immigration, is human trafficking. But that was not how I imagined smuggling. When I was growing up in India, I remember India had a very sort of protectionist economic policy. So buying any foreign goods was super expensive, very difficult. The government was trying to promote national production and like a cassette player. You had to buy something called Santosh. It was a really bad brand, but that was it. And so there was a huge demand and hunger to buy smuggled goods. And reading your book, I was actually reminiscing about those markets. I remember when I was young, that I would sometimes visit. They were called fancy markets in Calcutta, where you could get all these foreign smuggled goods. And I now think about, how was it possible for everyone in the city to know that you could buy smuggled goods there? It was being sold openly and it was illegal. That is one demand, right? There's no availability and you're trying to meet that availability problem. The other example, Max, I have is, what happens in cross-border trade between Norway and Sweden. So, we often travel over to neighboring Sweden to buy cheap stuff, cheap groceries, even gasoline sometimes, by the way. And this is it's a multi-billion-dollar business. And, but that is because it is affordable. So you have human trafficking, unavailability of certain goods. It could be the affordability aspect. But in your case, in this fantastic book, it's also about youth unemployment. It's not just the states that are willing to overlook these illegal activities. It could also be that smuggling has a lot of legitimacy in local communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my favorite things about working on smuggling is that almost everybody I talk to has personal experience. So I love the fancy markets that you're mentioning, but I also really like that you're bringing in a kind of a European example. So I mean, I grew up in Germany, and again, almost everybody I know at home has some experience of having moved something across into Eastern Germany or out of Eastern Germany or sent parcels. So I think it's really a lot more common than people often assume it is. And the number of things that are being smuggled is a lot more diverse than people think they are. I think people's heads tend to go to kind of cocaine and cannabis. But in North Africa, where I've done most of my work, by some orders of magnitude, gasoline is the most smuggled goods, if it is in terms of dollar value or weight or volume. but also Hello Kitty backpacks and tea and glasses and just all kinds of goods for many reasons, as you point out. Sometimes these things aren't available locally. Sometimes it's around getting around taxes and tariffs. In other contexts, historically, it's been around getting around sanctions. So there's a lot of reasons why smuggling happens that isn't just kind of drugs and guns. And when consumer goods are being smuggled, they need to be sold somewhere. So I like the fancy markets that you're describing because they're very similar to markets that I've studied, not just in North Africa, but also in other parts of West Africa, because there's a consumer good, so you need a consumer marketplace. The second you have these consumer marketplaces, a certain amount of regulation comes in. So these things aren't being sold on the back of a kind of from the back of a van or from a car at night. They're sold in places where they interact with normal consumers and households. So also kind of a process of normalization comes in. Usually municipalities then immediately start figuring out some way to charge rent or fee or something that starts looking like a tax on people who sell these goods. And all of a sudden they kind of start getting integrated into kind of the regular economy. The point of legitimacy that you make, I think, is really important to me. So one of the reasons I've studied kind of smuggling of gasoline and Hello Kitty backpacks and these things, and not just, cocaine or arms, is that that's where the labor intensive activity is. So the smuggling of consumer goods, especially in North Africa, is the bit that employs thousands and thousands of people. While, smuggling of cocaine might be higher value, but is not quite as labor intensive. And that, I think, where it becomes a story of how economies in borderlands have quite consciously been built around this availability of smuggling. So in the countries that I work in, you often have a kind of a post-independence political settlement where formal income generating opportunities are really centralized around the kind of economic centers, which often are the capital cities or the coastal areas. And you can see that in the post-independence period, there's almost quite an explicit arrangement with the borderlands that, okay, you're not getting the new factory, you're not getting the new road, but you can kind of occupy yourself around the border, and we're going to let that happen, and that'll be a thing for you. And the interesting thing is that that is very explicitly understood in border communities. So the sense that, we are being given this opportunity because another opportunity has been taken from us. Like, this kind of, they close the door, they open the window, is a very explicit understanding of the role that smuggling plays in local livelihoods, and consequently ties to this legitimacy point where like people are then seeing new border infrastructure or kind of restrictions on smuggling, not as a security intervention, but as an interference with the development model that they've been offered. They might not necessarily have chosen. It might not have been their preference. It might not be their favorite activity, but there's a recognition that it's relevant and essential for employment locally, to get cheaper goods around. But really, as in many of the areas I've worked in, as the bedrock of local employment. And you see when the border closes, a lot of people are out of a job.
So it is in this context, I remember reading in your book the local phrases that were used. It was not directly about smuggling, but something like parallel trade, intra-border trade, informal trade. So these are ways in which I suppose those who are involved in smuggling can legitimize whatever is deemed to be illegal. So from the story that you paint in the book, I see the capital cities with all the regulation, the institutions saying all the right things that the state should be saying. We want to tax goods. If you want to bring something in, you have to pay a tax and then you can sell it. But in this case, what you're also describing is in the interiors or in the peripheries or in the borders, the state is actually willing to selectively implement, sometimes very purposefully overlook implementing these regulations because they're aware that they're not providing social protection, that there isn't much income from taxation going to these hinterlands. So people have to fend for themselves. So in a way, this is a sweet sort of arrangement where the state says, I'll provide you with the police force, I'll maintain law and order, I'll make sure that these illegal activities will not get out of control. In return, you guys fend for yourselves. You make a living. As long as you don't come and sell these goods very openly in the capital cities, it's fine. Is that a part of the story, Max?
That's definitely part of the story. I'm not sure it's a sweet arrangement. I'll come back to that, but it is an arrangement. So I think the key part of the story there is that it's a very active arrangement. And I think it's a really good example of how states very actively govern through selective enforcement, through kind of creating zones where certain activities are tolerated, sometimes for everybody, sometimes just for some people. So smuggling is a really vivid case study of that, but we can have the same conversation talking about kind of informal markets in city centers. We can have the same conversation talking about the toleration of growing of cannabis in certain areas of the world. So I think it's a really good case study of kind of selective enforcement by states as a very conscious tool of governance in a space where we often assume states are not active, states are not present. But when we go there, we often see that the arm of the state is very long, and the arm of the state is very actively involved in structuring these economies in order to get access to income generating opportunities for some people, but also sometimes not for others. So this idea that these things are selective and very conscious, I think, is very important there. And interestingly enough, that happens in the capital as well, right? So we think often about smuggling at the border, kind of at a mountainous border that cars are driving over or that people are bringing stuff over. But if you look at what's happening in ports, if you look at what's happening in airports, a lot of smuggling is happening through big businessmen also under-declaring their wares, under-declaring their goods, having specific arrangements with customs, or having specific arrangements with political regimes in order to get their things in cheaper.
But Max, don't you think in the borderlands it may be more visible and a bit more invisible, at least as a conscious attempt to hide it in the capitals? That may not be the case elsewhere.
Yeah, I think in the borderlands, it's at least more visible to the people of the borderlands. I think it might be less visible to people in the center. But I think that the important point there is that these kind of selective enforcements are happening at the top and the bottom, right? So there's often a tendency by kind of chambers of commerce and big business associations to kind of look down on the smugglers and go, oh, this is all illoyal competition. They're all breaking the law, and not really having a conversation around the fact that, some of the big businessmen are doing the same thing, also tolerated by the state, but at a kind of very different level of the political economy. So this idea that, these markets are being selectively governed through selective enforcement, I think exists. Yeah, it exists in the ports and the airports, but it also exists on the land border. I do want to come back to the fact that it's not always a sweet arrangement, right? So I think a lot of the arguments I make is to highlight that this is a conscious arrangement, that this is something that has not always undermined states, but has often contributed to stability in borderlands. But that often puts me a little bit at risk of sounding like I'm advertising this as a state building model, which I'm very much not. I think the other side of the story that's important to tell is that smuggling economies tend to generate very unequal economies. It tends to generate very gendered economies. And it does tend to distribute risk very unevenly. You see these people kind of making quite a lot of money, beginning to have other people work for them, kind of accumulate resources, beginning to invest in, cafes in the capital city. And then you still have other people who kind of are the drivers across the border, and they're taking a lot of the risks. They are the ones that get involved when there's trouble at the border, when people get shot at, when there's accidents, and they often make very little money. So these are very unequal economies. These are often economies that are not building skills and are not giving people alternatives, and that are then extremely vulnerable to borders being closed, value chains changing. There being conflicts nearby, which we see in North Africa. It's been a large part of the conversation in the last couple of years. So it's not necessarily a sweet arrangement, but I think it is an arrangement. And that's the important thing to recognize, that it's not just a security thing about building fences and securing a border, but there's an economic part of it. There's a development part of it that we need to think about.
So it's a marriage of convenience. You can be called out as a state, right? I mean, you could have civil society organizations saying, why are you accepting this? This is undermining our trust in government. We don't want to pay taxes. I mean, there are all of these people getting rich and they're in the informal economy. The state is not taxing them. Or why are we being taxed? I suppose they can be called out. Have they been called out, Max? And I'm just thinking about the two cases that you write about in the book, Tunisia and Morocco. What is so special about North Africa and smuggling? And I'm sure there's a lot of commonality between Sweden, Norway, and North Africa. There may be some of the same issues that we talked about earlier, but you mentioned the political sphere here and a particular term, informed authoritarian bargain. Tell us a bit more about that and how does that apply to these two countries and that region generally, which perhaps helps explain this marriage of convenience.
Yeah, I think in many ways, obviously, I can tell you a story about why Tunisia and Morocco are particularly fascinating case studies, and obviously they're very close to my heart. But I think in many ways they're not terribly unusual case studies for these types of dynamics. So by far not the first person to write about this, and especially with across kind of Western and Sub-Saharan Africa, there's a great literature of people who spend a lot of time in border communities or written from border communities. Same with particularly the US-Mexico border, where there's incredibly rich scholarship of people who've written about this. So I don't think the case studies I have are terribly unusual, but they've kind of had interesting parallel developments over the last couple of decades, both in terms of their post-independence history, but then also obviously with the revolution in Tunisia in 2011 and kind of Morocco's slightly more kind of top-down management of the situation. So it's been a convenient time for me to watch this kind of period of intense renegotiation of what is possible at the border and how does the state engage with that. So it's been a convenient place to study, but I wouldn't want to imply that this is a North Africa story or a Morocco or Tunisia story. I think it's a much wider one. What I call an informal authoritarian bargain is, I think it starts with the kind of shorthand of the formal authoritarian bargain that comes up a lot, especially in the political history of countries of the Middle East and partially North Africa, as a shorthand for a social contract in kind of the immediate post-independence years, where authoritarian regimes, populist authoritarian regimes, were broadly tolerated by a wider populace in exchange for wide-reaching formal employment in the public sector, subsidies, a certain amount of stability. That is often kind of broadly referred to as this kind of authoritarian bargain. We can have a longer conversation about whether it existed or not, and whether that's the best term to call it. But what I try to point out is that I think that bargain only ever existed for some people. So this idea that you're getting employment in the formal sector, you're getting kind of all these formal state distributed resources that existed in some areas, and in other areas it was always a different bargain. So it was this informal authoritarian bargain. It was an exchange of, again, acquiescence towards an authoritarian regime in exchange for the toleration of certain illegal activities that were still formally, technically illegal, which also gives some benefits to the people doing it because it means the state can also exclude other people from doing it. There were attempts, for example, to keep big businessmen from the political center away from getting involved in the smuggling economy. But it also puts you on a different trajectory of that being renegotiated. So the way that a citizen renegotiates the degree to which a state involves in its formal education system or, renegotiates state employment has been a big part of how we thought about changing social contracts and narrowing social contracts in many parts of the world. But I think alongside of that, we forget that there's this other part of that social contract, this kind of informal bargain where tolerating certain activities and allowing them to generate people's livelihoods has also been part of that arrangement through which people have acquiesced to the existence of the post-independent state. And those are also being renegotiated. And those are more difficult for people to renegotiate. It's more difficult for people to put pressure on the state saying, we should still be allowed to smuggle here because that was the deal. And you haven't done anything else for us. Civil society organizations forming around that is a lot more complicated, but it's really present for people. And I think that's where Tunisia and Morocco are good examples again, because we've seen mass mobilization in both countries throughout the last couple of decades around a wider recognition that people can identify with having to rely on illegal activities in order to make a living, and being harassed for that by the state and being taken advantage of by security services, by the police, and getting a feeling of kind of indignity and kind of the criminalization of their livelihoods. So in Tunisia, the obvious example is the fruit and vegetable vendor who set himself on fire after an altercation with a municipal agent and started kind of serving as one of the symbols for the 2011 uprising, where a lot of people kind of felt a certain allegiance with this idea that someone was relying on a certain livelihood that was somewhat criminalized by the state and was being harassed for that. And Morocco, though less publicized, has had similar examples in the last couple of years. There's been a fish vendor in northern Morocco who was selling his fish informally, had these fish confiscated by the police. They were thrown in the back of a kind of a garbage compactor truck. He jumped in after his wares, and someone turned on the truck, and he was crushed to death in the back of this truck. And it was again one of those moments where a lot of people who were not necessarily smugglers or were not necessarily fish vendors, but who could recognize this experience of having to make a livelihood in a context where the state doesn't technically make all your work legal, makes it very hard to make everything legal, where you're relying on informal employment opportunities, you're being harassed by the police, your main point of contact with the state isn't its formal structure, but its security structure. The indignity that comes with that felt very close to a lot of people. So you had a large kind of uprising that responded to this particular instance. And I do think that mirrors across a lot of the places we work in that have very large informal economies, and where I think we've ignored the fact that that is a really central way in which people engage with the state and through which people's economic activities and livelihoods are being negotiated. And I think we often forget that when we focus on the formal channels.
And you're right. I was wrong by calling it a sweet deal because it's this negotiation, constant renegotiation. And you will always have some people not being very happy with the current arrangements. It could be the smugglers themselves who want a bigger share of the market, easier access to the capitals, maybe where the consumers are with spending power. But you could also have different agencies within the state that aren't aware. So you could have one agency tolerating smuggling, the other implementing strict controls. And that's where I think the story you present, Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia and Mohsen Fikri in Morocco, those two vendors, the plight of the vendors who are operating in the informal economy most likely, but are being harassed by officials who may not have got the memo, from the state or from whoever saying that, okay, you guys be nice to these people. And that is perhaps what I was alluding to when I asked you, is the pushback. And it is when those sensational stories happen, which led to the start of the Arab Spring, that's when everybody wakes up saying, oh, this is not acceptable. So I suppose that process of this constant negotiation, renegotiation is taking place. But how does this work in practice, Max? I mean, what are the goods that people really want? When I don't get access to cheap gas, is that when I will get upset with the government? Is it when the Hello Kitty bags are getting more expensive or difficult to get for my kids? Is that when I get upset? So how does this work, this negotiation process? Who are the main actors involved? Are there formal groups of gasoline vendors and smugglers and textile smugglers who are actually meeting, negotiating? And I know that in your cases, particularly in gas, I think you point out that they're not very sort of centralized or structured, whereas the textile industry is. So how does this take place with local officials? Maybe there's a bribery channel to the key players. Somehow the revenue is being distributed, right? So give us a little sense of how this plays out in practice.
Yeah, I think that is where it's been really useful to look at Tunisia and Morocco over the last decade or so, just because there's been so much renegotiation. There's been kind of national level political changes, regional political changes, and as a consequence of that, a lot of local renegotiation on what's possible, who can do what. And one of the most, I think, maybe the least surprising bit of it, but the bit that has taken up a lot of my thinking around it is that all of this is hugely perforated by power, by economic power, but also political and social power, about who can negotiate, about who can bring together other people to put pressure on, about who can
You mean
organize
the power brokers?
action, about who can be a power broker, but also who can shift their status from being, a smuggler to then respected businessman, who can, buy a couple of cafes and move over. So one of the things that's been really interesting to me is try to understand through all those changes, who are the people that thrive and who are the people that once again get marginalized. So I think this question of can can you organize is really, really central to that. So vendors in cities, people who kind of sell their things in organized markets, there's usually a certain amount of collective action there that's useful. There's often also a certain amount of social capital there. Often, if you're a vendor in the market, maybe your father's already been a vendor in the market, maybe you're kind of part of a wider trade, you picked up some skills along the way. So we do see them benefiting from a certain amount of collective action negotiation, often aimed at municipalities. At the same time, we see some people make it very, very well by themselves. But what we often also see is people who are being left behind because they're not able to bargain on these terms. So one of the things that I think are really interesting and really odd about how smuggling is regulated are these kind of informal deals and arrangements. These kind of rules that I find at the borders that I study, but it exists at lots of borders around the world, where it isn't you can't bring any cigarettes in. It isn't you can never smuggle cigarettes, but it's like there's a gate in the border between 8 p.m. and midnight, and you can bring cigarettes through there, but you're going to have to pay 200 to the local policeman, but then you can go through. And what I found is that a lot of these kind of deals exist, and they're often not super personalized. You don't have to be someone's cousin. You don't have to be the friend of the policeman. They're kind of broad, informal arrangements that then lots of people who don't have any other opportunities start taking advantage of. So you have kind of broader sections of the borderland population getting involved in this. But the problem is if your livelihood is dependent not on you having a specific skill, not on you being part of a network or a family or a clan, but just on having access to this rule, if that thing collapses, if the rules on the border change, if the terms change, you've got nothing. You don't have a collective group that you can bargain with. You don't have a person on the other end that helps you out. And I think that's been, one of the most worrying parts of these dynamics that I've seen is that you do have people whose livelihoods have depended on these kind of informal bargains and arrangements. And I've seen these informal bargains and arrangements collapse, and people then being left in a very, very vulnerable position because they have very little to go and negotiate with.
Why do these arrangements collapse? Is it a change of official? Is it a change of political messaging? Is it some other concern about security that crops up on the agenda? What happens?
All kinds of reasons. So these arrangements are often quite volatile because so many other things happen around borders. So it can be, in the case of southern Tunisia, it's largely the civil war in Libya, which has both kind of made supply routes more difficult, but also meant the actor on the other side of the border often changed, and things constantly get renegotiated as different people start making claims to being able to extract some rent from that particular trade route. But it can also be, and in many places around the world, it's been increasing anxiety around open borders, around border porosity. It's certainly been, for the case of North Africa, a European anxiety around migration and a European interest in heavily investing in border fortifications in North Africa with relatively little, and that maybe brings us back to a starting point, relatively little thought into what that will do in practice. There's a general sense that border porosity is bad and it's used by bad actors and we got to crack down on it. We want to build fences and walls. But there's relatively little understanding of how smuggling there works in practice, about doors in fences, but also the fact that most of what goes across might be gasoline or blue jeans or carpets and not necessarily cocaine and guns. So there's very little understanding of what that then does to local economies. So often we see an investment in border infrastructure that, first of all, does very little to crack down on the stuff you actually want to crack down on. There's very little evidence that border fences do anything to cocaine smuggling. These are highly sophisticated and highly capitalized networks that are not terribly intimidated by another fence. But the person who was bringing gasoline across on the back of a mule and had no other livelihood opportunity, that thing might collapse because of the fence. So as a consequence, you might actually destabilize borderlands when you are investing in border infrastructure because you don't understand the role that the border played for that community. And I think we're seeing a lot of that play out in a lot of the world. And I think perhaps the strongest argument for doing work on this is try to get a slightly better understanding around what happens when we build border infrastructure and what that does to border communities.
Well, this reminds me of one of the quotes I read in your book, one of the chapters where I think it's a border control agent saying, tomatoes and terrorists. If something can get through, if tomatoes can come through, that means the porous border would also allow a terrorist to come. I was also thinking something else, Max, in terms of the negotiation or the renegotiation. We can't assume that everyone is pushing for something. There'll also be others pushing against it. So there must surely be in every society actors who are playing by the rules, by the formal rules, who are paying their taxes, who are actually selling gasoline through legitimate means, selling textiles legitimately, who feel that their businesses are being undermined by the influx of smuggled goods. And they must surely be lobbying government, their own power brokers, to push back against this. Did you find a lot of that? I mean, they're not just smugglers trying to make their case, but many others are pushing back against smugglers.
Yes, absolutely. Formal business communities, on the one hand, have been lobbying substantially for states to not just crack down on smuggling, but crack down on economic informality more broadly. But also, again, foreign actors, the European Union, international development support has also been part of this narrative that, we need to crack down on this. It's also been very, very popular for kind of populist politicians, right? Coming out there and saying you're going to crack down on smuggling doesn't just make you look tough on crime. It also externalizes the crime. It gives a sense that, these are things that are coming from the outside. These are foreign powers. These are illoyal populations and all that kind of stuff. There's a whole lot of kind of bad mouthing of borderland communities and othering of borderland communities coming in that is very convenient for a whole range of actors. I think it's a deep misunderstanding of the people involved. It's a securitization of an economic reality that we ignore, but it's incredibly politically powerful. In the context of North Africa, I think the conflation between these kind of cross-border trade and terrorism has given another angle to this discussion. So that borderland communities often get maligned as kind of, in league with the terrorists or kind of creating the spaces in the border for the terrorists, which there's very little evidence that that's what's actually happening. But it feels very real to borderland communities. So there was because you were talking about people coming together as associations, there was a committee in a town in southern Tunisia that's a big smuggling hub. And this committee, local kind of civil society committee, de facto functioned as kind of a local spokes group for smugglers, kind of a local civil society organization of smugglers, so to say. And that committee managed to get a meeting with the Tunisian president at the time. This was Mansour Marzouki, a kind of big human rights activist who I think took a bold but very positive step in saying, okay, I'm going to meet with this committee. We're going to talk about the situation. And the number one bit of the agenda on this committee, the number one demand they had was that a TV program was to be made that pointed out that they are not terrorists. That was number one point on their agenda.
But they're Robin Hoods, maybe, not
Um,
terrorists?
so I'm not sure they'd go that far, but I think they would think of themselves as businessmen. And I think this kind of association with terrorism was something that didn't just kind of hurt them personally, but also I think was part of this wider othering and securitization of a conversation that they wanted to have on economic terms. They wanted to have on like, we're absolutely willing for border economies to look differently, but we have to have a conversation about livelihoods and employment, not just around building fences. So yeah, that always stuck with me, that this lobbying against them, and especially the framing of that lobbying against them as terrorism or as kind of a danger to the nation, has always felt incredibly hurtful to borderland communities, who are often the first that are affected when there are actual security issues at borders.
But Libya has been in trouble for a long time now. Isn't there any concern that some of the bad actors from Libya, together with the gasoline, would be coming into other countries, neighboring countries?
Yes, I don't think they need the gasoline. So, I mean, if you look at any map and you look at the border between Tunisia and Libya, it's a very large border. It is a very difficult border to fortify. And I think a highly capitalized actor, an armed group that has an interest in making an inroad into that border at some space to get some people across, similarly to a highly capitalized smuggling network that wants to bring across cannabis or guns or cocaine or smartphones, high value goods that are kind of compact. They're going to be able to do that no matter how many night vision apparatuses you buy for the Tunisian police or how many border fences you build there. they're not reliant on the gasoline smugglers to bring things across. So I think the idea that the smuggling of illicit goods is creating a kind of generalized porosity that other actors can then use, I think is a misunderstanding of almost all borders work. Both of these things exist, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're in league with each other.
One of the many fascinating aspects of your work is that you actually, the methodology of studying smugglers. How does this work out? I mean, what kind of identity do you have in the field? Did you obviously I read your book and you've visited some of these communities, you've interacted with officials, hundreds of interviews, participant observation. But this also means that you gain the trust of certain groups, that you're not there. This is one of the challenges I often face in the field, particularly a new area, trying to legitimize my presence. Why am I there? Am I going to report to somebody? Am I a CIA informant? Things like that, particularly when it relates to corruption or illicit activities. So tell us a little bit about what it means, I mean, in terms of the methodology of studying smugglers.
Yeah, I mean, the book is broadly an ethnography. So it's based on spending a lot of time in those two borderlands and talking to a lot of people there, including smugglers from a variety of networks, but also kind of civil society and street level bureaucrats and all that. I think it's like every ethnography, it's partial. So it is based on the questions I was able to ask, based on the conversations I was able to have. And there's a lot of questions I'm not able to ask and conversations I'm not able to have as a function of who I am, but also as a function of my limitations as a researcher. So I think the first bit of any methodology on this is recognizing that you're telling a partial story and recognizing which is the story that you can tell and which is the stories that hopefully other people are telling. And I think for me, this focus on institutions and kind of the rules of the game of how smuggling is done was something that I realized I could have conversations about. So I couldn't have a conversation with people about who is your supplier, but I can have a conversation with people about how do people tend to meet their supplier. I couldn't have a conversation with people about who is the general at the border, but I can have a conversation around how much does it pay to get something across the border. So I think framing it in these more abstract terms was both a methodology bit, but also became a large part of the story I was trying to tell around the fact that these generalized rules that people all know and understand and can talk to you about exist. Another bit I think was about how you talk to people.
Yep.
So you said earlier, like people don't describe themselves as smugglers, but describe themselves as businessmen or engage in cross-border trade. So I think picking up over a time about how people think about themselves and talk about themselves was a really important part as well. So learning that you don't ask people if they're a smuggler, you ask people how business is going, and you tell people that you've heard it's been a bit difficult the last couple of months, and you try to get a sense of them for how they feel. So I think meeting people where they are has been a really important part of that. But I think that's not just researching smuggling, that's probably researching pretty much everything.
Yeah, I remember doing some work on corruption. I could never ask somebody, are you corrupt? That would be the end of the conversation. But asking them to reflect on the phenomena, how others are perceived, who is corrupt among your friends or your contacts, that would elicit a lot of interesting discussion. A final issue, Max, based on this case or these two case studies, on your work, your ongoing work on smuggling, what lessons are there for European policymakers, for the Trump administration that talks about the wall, less so now, but in our countries with Schengen, with the free movement of peoples, we some people say we've lost control over our borders. Most of the discussion is on drugs or cigarettes or alcohol, and of course, illegal migrants. But the other aspects, some of the more important economic aspects that you identify in your study are perhaps overlooked. So, what would your suggestions be that we focus more on closer to home?
I think that's a great question. And there are other smuggling researchers who are better able to speak about that than I am, especially in the US and especially people who come from the context of the American border. But I think one thing that's true globally is that a certain political movement, and increasingly many political movements, are selling us a vision of a type of border control that has never existed. This idea that we're going back to a context where states have total control over everything that goes across their border has historically never been true, and in many parts of the world is not a reasonable way to approach border security. The idea that every border is a fence and that every gate is perfectly controlled is historically untrue and practically unlikely. We do need to think of border communities as part of the wider institutional and human structure around borders. And so we do need to bring them in as part of the conversation. And that's going to depend on which border you're at. But to think of this as kind of hermetically sealed contexts rather than wider social and economic spaces where people live is politically incredibly powerful, but it is simply untrue and it is something we need to resist. And the practical consequence of that is fencing. We have a modern fetishization of infrastructure and borders. We don't really think about what it does. And we have an avalanche of academic research that highlights that it doesn't do what we think it does and that it has side effects. And it's a conversation I don't see us having. It's a conversation that connects an economic and a security aspect of these spaces. We often focus on the security aspect, but we need to recognize there's an economic and social and distributional one. And that's probably a lesson we find in many of the places we work in, but that's the part of the lesson that I find in the border communities that I've worked in.
Max, congrats on a fantastic book. I'm a huge admirer of your work, so please keep the good work going. And thank you very much for this lovely conversation, for coming on my show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Bannock from the University of Oslo. Please email your questions, comments and suggestions to inpursuitofdevelopment@gmail.com.